Hi, I'm Dr. Robin Koslowitz, clinical psychologist, parenting educator, and post-traumatic parent. Welcome to the Post-Traumatic Parenting Podcast, where we learn to provide our children with a healthy childhood, even if ours was anything but. Or maybe we had a wonderful childhood, but recent events in our lives have left us reeling. Let's face it, after 2020, we're all post-traumatic parents now. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Season 3 of the Post-Traumatic Parenting Podcast. I am so excited because today we get to talk to Dr. Frank Putnam, who is one of the leading experts in the world on the impact of child maltreatment, child sexual abuse, growing up in adverse experiences on adult psychological functioning. He's one of the world's experts on dissociative states and on altered states, and really a lot of things that we in the post-traumatic parenting community talk about. Like, his research is very, very foundational to a lot of our understanding of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, to our understanding, particularly for me, to our understanding of how to parent with a traumatized brain. So I'm super excited to talk to Dr. Putnam, and I am going to ask him to introduce himself. His new book, by the way, is out now. It's not out in audio yet. I know all the post-traumatic parents always ask, but when is it out in audio? Moms need audio. And it's almost out in audio. Like, I have it on my wish list on Audible, almost out in audio, but you're going to get to hear all about it. But it's also already out as a book. So anybody who still actually reads can get the actual book. I know me lately, every book I own is both in a physical copy and audio, but that's just me. I need to underline with pens, so I'm still old-fashioned that way. So without further ado, Dr. Putnam, can you please introduce yourself to our community?
Thank you very much for having me, Robin. I appreciate it. I'm sorry if my voice is a little hoarse. You know, I have some health problems. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this kind of a conversation about post-traumatic parenting, because I think this issue of parenting, and particularly this intergenerational interaction, which is part of that family cycle of violence, is really, really important to sort of understand better so that we can intervene more. I come at it from a couple of different angles, but I'm going to talk primarily about it from my sort of three areas of research that I've been involved in, and that is, the book that you mentioned, it's called Old Before Their Time, is about our 35 plus year study of really three generations. We started out with sexually abused girls, and then a matched comparison group, ages 6 to 15 when they came into the study. We followed them for 35 plus years. They're now in their late 30s and 40s. And we've looked at them, we've looked at their offspring, so we've looked at them as both children growing up who experienced abuse. We looked at their offspring. And then we also, their mothers came in for the first three sessions or so. That is, we've seen them 8 separate times over that 35 period of years. And their mothers came in for at least for the first 3 times because we needed basically a legal guardian to sign the informed consent process like that. So we took advantage of that to meet and talk with the mothers at quite a lot of length about both their experiences parenting these children, but also thinking about their own parents. You know, so in a sense we have 3 generations we've laid eyes on and a 4th generation that we've heard about. And then we have a comparison group that was non-abused, or that is at least non-sexually abused in the same way. Unfortunately, many of those comparison girls ended up having sexual assaults over time, but the rates were about twice as high with the maltreated kids as they were with the non-maltreated kids. So that's one perspective. Another perspective is, for a dozen years, I was scientific director of a fairly large-scale intervention with sort of at-risk families. in which we were dealing with very young mothers, mothers with histories of trauma, mothers with histories of mental illness, mothers who didn't receive much prenatal care, teenage mothers. A number of risk factors could get you into this program. It was called Every Child Succeeds, and it was looking at helping these mothers become as we said, the best mothers they could possibly be. And then the third is that for, again, in about a dozen years, I ran what we called the Traumatic Treatment Replication Center, in which we basically train therapists in evidence-based treatments to treat traumatized families. And we used intergenerational models, so parents and kids, foster parents and kids. So those are three sort of major perspectives in which we had a chance to look at issues of parenting over time with that. So I kind of draw on all those experiences. Plus, I am a parent. You're never not a parent, as you know. But my kids are grown at this point in time and off on their own, living in different states and stuff.
So, and your research is so foundational on this idea that, our damage both does damage us, but at the same token, that doesn't mean that inevitably we're going to pass it all down to our kids, right? That cycle breaking can happen. It leaves its marks, certainly, old before their time. You're talking about what happens to us in terms of chronic stress does leave its mark, but that doesn't mean inevitably
absolutely.
We're going to harm
In
our
fact,
kids.
really, often the first fact I start with is that the vast majority of parents who are maltreated, for example, don't maltreat their children. And that number is about 70% don't maltreat their children. But that leaves you another 30%. Now,
Wow.
Of that 30%, many are not the primary perpetrators. They simply are associating with other people who are the primary perpetrators. This is especially true for mothers, that they get involved with males who are also perpetrating males, kind of thing. So, the message is that the vast majority do not go on to replicate this. So unfortunately, about a third do, and that third is about 6 times higher than people who don't have histories of maltreatment. So it's a pretty significant contribution. And we're trying to understand, well, what are the things that make that happen? That leads to that continuity of violence. And that's something I'm still very, very interested in studying. It's a very hard thing to study if you think about studying things that cross generations. How many generations can you basically follow? Not a lot. And now generations are changing so fast. And there's so many things happening to the relationships between parents and children as a result of the kind of technology that's coming in. It's really something that's very hard to sort of study, though I have some ideas about how to do that.
Yeah, I think this is such a hopeful thought that 70% of us don't, right? We don't, and that which means that we are more likely than not to be able to parent in a healthy way, because so many post-traumatic parents come to me and say, isn't it inevitable? Like it's I feel so damaged. I feel polluted. I feel like, hey, the only models I have are bad. I feel like the only I carry so much psychological baggage. And for what you're really saying is, well, 70% don't, right? Which means going into parenting, that's already hopeful that you are, especially if you're coming to someone like me, right? And you're saying, I don't want to perpetrate this. You're already likely to be in the 70%, right? Now you want to get better and better. And of course we want to heal as much as possible, but it's not only not inevitable, it's more likely that you won't perpetrate. getting into unhealthy family dynamics with, a partner who maybe unconsciously reminds you of a father, and you think, oh, that's what guys are. That feels, the comforting sometimes the safe and familiar, well, let's say it differently. What's familiar feels safe to our psyche sometimes, and that's sometimes why people will marry a partner who has the same negative traits that a parent did. So that's, I think, something we have to pay attention to, but sounds like you're not more likely than not. The opposite. It's just very, very helpful, very hopeful to hear. For myself,
I was going to say, that's absolutely true.
Go on, sorry.
And the thing that really makes that difference, that who's in that 70%, it's those people who've come to grips with their trauma. And I say this based on a particularly pivotal study done at the University of Minnesota by Alan Schroof and Byron Eglin and John Ogawa and collaborators. And they basically looked, it was called the Minnesota Mother-Child Study. And they looked at women and children, newborns who were at high risk demographically to become abusive mothers, and they followed the children into early adulthood, and they looked at what was it that separated the mothers whose children were abused versus the mothers whose children were not abused. And that single most important factor was acknowledging your own abuse. So it was that coming to grips with what happened to you that made the difference in terms of basically not being an abusive or a parent of an abused child. Is again, I'd stress that many of these women don't actually do the abuse, they just connect with partners who do.
Yeah, very true. Because I have you, so I'm lucky enough to get to ask this question. It's a personal question of mine. So everyone who's familiar with my story in the post-traumatic parenting community knows that my biggest trauma, I would say my biggest trauma adaptation for me was dissociation. As a child, I grew up with a father who was extremely chronically ill, multiple times having to run to the hospital. Ultimately, and everyone in the community knows this, it's a hard story to hear, but ultimately when I was 16, he had his fatal heart attack and he died in my arms as I attempted to perform CPR on him. And after that, I developed real dissociative traits where my dissociation was highly adaptive in some ways. I was a really geeky student, and I would just disappear into my work, but to the point that like a fire alarm could be ringing around me, I wouldn't notice. In some ways, for me, it was very adaptive. Like I commuted from New Jersey to NYU where I got my PhD, and I could literally sit on a train and do research the whole way home, like just be coding data or writing a paper. There could be a drunk guy like drooling on my shoulder, I wouldn't notice. Not great for self-defense and like situational awareness, but for a young mother in grad school, fabulous, right? Because I could literally focus as though I'm in the ideal controlled environment, do a lot of research in that 2-hour commute, and then get home and, be a parent to my kids. The problem was, as a mom, when my son was 10 years old, he actually asked me where I go when I go away behind my eyes, and he started to cry. And for me, it felt so scary because my dissociation was so automatic that it was as if he said, like, just change your hair color. Like, don't have brown hair anymore. I want your hair to be blonde. It was like, what, like, how do I even do that? Like, I knew what he was talking about. Like, I'd heard that from friends before. I knew this about myself, but I really did have, it had such automaticity. I just had no ability to control it. Therapy helped. Eventually, I did learn to control it. But I'd love to understand dissociation better.
Wouldn't we
and
all,
I'd love
in
to
a
ask
sense?
you about
But
it.
I mean, I think we think of dissociation as a continuum process. That everybody dissociates. Some people dissociate more than other people. It's a defense mechanism, as you found out personally. And it's that, we talk about fight, flight. It's really fight, flight, freeze. And that's the shutting down, shutting out the outside world. And it's many ways the response of the powerless, the helpless child. Is it's in the animal world, it's the the deer or the baby fawn who lies still, or the baby rabbit or whatever. They don't have the resources to fight or flight, but they can freeze, and literally there are physiological signs. We see heart rate drop, for example. We see vagal tone change. We actually see physical changes in the person when they go into that frozen state. Now, dissociation, in some people, if the trauma starts really, really early, they can develop those alter identity states. A lot of people just do kind of what you're describing, sort of space out and shut down and close off the world, and that's adaptive to a certain extent, as you point out. It basically screens you off from things that are really overwhelmingly traumatic. It keeps out of awareness lots of things that would be very disturbing. And so I don't see it as necessarily pathological until it starts to interfere with your life. And it's the kind of thing many people do learn to manage, in a sense, and they kind of have it in their bag of adaptive abilities, but it's you can't let it take over so that you lose a lot of time, or you find yourself places you don't know how you got there, or people keep coming up to you and telling you you did things that you have no idea of, that seem out of character, or those sorts of things. Those kind of time loss experiences are more typical of really severe early trauma. Kinds of things. Now, there's just a lot to what makes something traumatic, and that's so when we talk about trauma, really it's a huge spectrum of experiences for people, and there are certain things that make it, quote, worse than other things that are more likely to result in that kind of response, or post-traumatic stress disorder. But I think you think of it as a psychological process. To some extent, it's like depression, it's like anxiety. Everybody has some. It becomes a problem when it interferes with your life. I think it for some people, and particularly people like artists or musicians or people who really want to focus on something, it's actually quite adaptive, and many of them will go into kind of an adaptive state like that, and it gives them a kind of ironically single-mindedness. That's all you focus on. You don't have intrusive thoughts. You don't think about what you're going to do here or there, or what bills you have to pay or something like that. It allows you to just kind of really narrowly focus. It can cause problems when that interferes with the rest of your life, when you don't have the sort of ability to carry on and be aware of the other things going on in your life.
Yeah, so when it like takes you over as opposed to you using it, that's where it's a problem. I've never really understood why, for me, it became so calming. For a long time, it became my only way of calming down, because I would become a brain, not a body. So then if my heart was pounding and I was having a panic attack, the panic attack would completely go away, but like from 1 second to the next. Like you could literally see it in me. My husband especially could see me panic and then disappear. But I don't know why. I still don't quite understand why that happens. Like it's like I flood and then perfect calmness, as if the panic attack hadn't been happening a second ago. My heart rate was really high and then it disappeared.
And of course, that's one of the major markers biologically for dissociation, is actually your heart rate drops. And sort of everything kind of slows down and the world kind of closes in. So it's triggered. And I think you can think of it as a change in mental state, that you're now in a dissociative state. There are lots of different states. There are anxiety states, there are depressed states, there are catatonic states, there are intoxicated states, there are states of joy, there are states of meditative states. There are all these different kinds of states. There are a few threads that link them all together. Usually they're transient, that they have a kind of a history that you go into it, it builds up, it becomes full, and then it goes down. Think about an anxiety attack. Often the way in is fairly quick, and then it has a more slow offset, sorts of things. And there's often a switch. You're describing, that people have observed this rapid transition in you. Your son talked about going behind your eyes, and your husband can see it also. So state transitions can be very fast, and something like a bipolar patient can go from mania to depression states in a fairly quick time. An anxiety attack can be very quick, sort of thing. Catatonia can come on or off very quickly. So I'm quite interested in the mechanisms by which we change state. And I wrote another book about that. It's called The Way We Are. And it's really about states and the role of states in how the integration of states, so the more or less, creates a personality. So it's really a collection of all our states, and to some extent our ability to link those states in a more coherent whole is part of it. And that's what we call integration. And integration is not all or nothing. It's a very dynamic process. People depends on the situation to be more or less integrated. So you think about just in our language, when people get under stress, we talk about they're coming undone, they're coming unglued, they're falling to pieces. That reflects the fact that integration is breaking down, and you get your act together, pull it back in, those sorts of things. So we have this dynamic of integration that is susceptible to stress, kind of thing. These are all, I think, very interesting processes that we experience in little ways, and then when it's associated with trauma in much larger ways.
Yeah, I think The Way We Are, is not available in audio, right?
I don't. Yeah, I've had a lot of trouble. Okay, all right.
I have it in hard copy.
It should be. It should be. But the publisher and I are. The publisher, I could go into it, but I'm not dealing with the publisher. I hope to take the book back and do more with it at some point.
Yeah. I think what I read in The Way We Are the most, and tell me if this is a correct reading of your work, because you're talking about states and transitions from states, that good parenting is providing kids with integration, that they can understand that how you are in one state, there's a state that's appropriate for how you are with your friends that isn't appropriate for, I don't know, how you are with someone you don't trust as much, or someone, or school, or an exam. And the idea is that when the child can have coherence among states, that they understand themselves as someone who has different states and at different times, as opposed to globalizing their understanding of themselves based on one state of being. I used to think of myself as I'm this sort of this cowardly person who has to run away, right? But when you can understand yourself as a coherent whole, I have a state that's like this and a state that's like this, you're a healthier personality. And that's what we're going for in our parenting, giving our kids that sense of coherence among their states, that they can become an integrated adult.
That's pretty much exactly that the parent is very important in helping the child modulate states, and also generalizing knowledge across states. So the parent is there to help the child. What you learned here, you can transfer. One of the functions, or one of the issues of states, is that information is often what we call state dependent. You know how to do something in one context, but you haven't realized that you could also do that thing in another context. And that's kind of oh, I knew that, I just didn't think, Well, that's the issue of bringing knowledge from one state into another state, and that's very much a function of parenting, where remember what we learned at grandma, so we can do that here. Remember what we learned in church, this is what we can do, and then we can keep the same voice in the library or whatever. We begin to move that knowledge back and forth. So the parent's very important in terms of that bridging function that we often refer to as as
Right.
sort of metacognitive or executive functions in children. This idea that there's a kind of part that can, watching what's going on and match their state to the situation, and that we're teaching them how to do this as parents.
It seems to me, I'm thinking of a patient of mine whose mom has bipolar disorder, and her mom doesn't understand why my patient is kind of, not very natural in her presence and kind of very hypervigilant in her presence. When she's medicated and neither manic nor depressive, she does not remember the maltreatment she perpetrated on her daughter in highly manic states, including trying to kill her. I mean, like really highly in a delusional state where she believed she was doing something for God or whatever it was. She had some sort of a command hallucination that she had to do this. She doesn't remember it at all. So she does not understand why her daughter, is quite boundaried with her and hypervigilant in her presence, because she truly doesn't remember it, which I think people who don't understand bipolar, what do you mean you don't remember it? You did it. But in an altered state, you're saying, you wouldn't remember it.
This is state-dependent memory. And this is one of the things that causes fragmentation of the sense of self, is that you don't remember things that you do, therefore you have problems with cause and effect. You don't remember that what you did here is having an effect over here. And that's particularly true in states that are quite powerful states. There are some states, like you're irritable, you're bored. They're fairly minor. The boundaries between them are relatively minor. But there are other states that are very profound, like a bipolar state, or like a catatonic state, or like a dissociative state, or a panic attack, or something like that, where you can't get to information that you may know in other contexts, and particularly where you can't get memories of things that you've done, and people are telling you you did this, you did that, and you just have no recollection of that. You don't know what to believe, you don't know who to believe, and you also can't make amends because you didn't know that you did these things.
Is that how you made the transition from studying multiple personalities to child abuse and real child maltreatment? Was that the linkage?
Not particularly, but what was the linkage was that all the multiples I worked with said, I've been this way all my life. And it was only when I was 12, 13, 14 or something, I realized that people weren't like me. And that if people didn't lose time and people didn't find themselves places someplace and don't know how they got there, people didn't find themselves dressed in clothes they didn't remember putting on, and getting as kids getting back tests they don't remember taking, and this sort of lost time experience. So I thought, if that's true, I should be able to find child multiples. I mean, at that time particularly, all the critics were saying things like, well, it's just, it's a complicated act. It's just, these people are just acting, etc. And I felt, well, if I could find children that would, they would not have read Sybil or seen Three Faces of Eve. This is something that they were experiencing. So it was in the context of looking for sort of behaviorally disturbed children and looking at a lot of them. I said, well, there's a lot more going on here. And in particular, I was more concerned also about the biology. Now, dissociation has played a really we tracked it all along, and it is probably one of the things that really is predictive of all sorts of, poorer outcomes. And so when the moms who were really dissociative were the ones who continued the sort of harsh parenting practices when they had offspring, for example.
Yeah, that's fascinating that it's not like you were looking for it, but you were like, this is the population. This is where I'm going to find them. It reminds me of my graduate career. I felt like the runt of the litter in NYU because all of my classmates had these like very clear research focus, like, neo-Piagetian construction of language in 4-year-olds. And I was doing my clinical rotations and doing research, and I just picked rotations that sounded interesting to me. So I was in an encopresis clinic, and then I was in a clinic for kids who were behaviorally disturbed, and I was doing research on temperament-based parenting and temperament in children. And I really felt like, why don't I have one coherent research interest? Until like a little while later, I realized, it took a long time, and a therapist helped me with this, but I was like, oh, I'm studying the impact of childhood trauma on child development in order to help create parenting practices. Like I have a very, very coherent research, because you end up in an encopresis clinic and in a clinic for acting out kids. All you meet are sexually abused people. Like in the end, the large, vast majority of the population in both of those clinics were kids who were abused, or kids who were chronically neglected, or sexually abused and chronically neglected and chronically maltreated in many ways. But it took time for me to realize that, oh, that's what I'm studying. I think it's true that all research is research, at least for me. So for me, it was very personal of trying to figure this out, because I want to be a good mom, right? And it's just so interesting that you were looking for child multiple personalities, and you found child sexual abuse.
Well, and of course, this is back in the early 80s, and I hardly knew about child sexual abuse. It really was totally off the radar at that point in time. So it was sort of the same experience, which was that, oh, it's really their child abuse that I'm looking at, and it comes out in different ways, but generally these kids don't adapt well to the situation, and they are seen as problematic or disturbed or troublemakers or whatever. And so that's when I really said, well, dissociation's important, but really the story here is what has happened to the children and how that plays out in their lives.
So can you tell us a little bit about, now I'm thinking about the biological aging, like your newest book, and, the study, the FDGS study, and, I'm sorry, the FGDS study, I'm tired today, but just like this idea of, tell us about that, because I think we're hearing this a lot in the post-traumatic parenting community about our autoimmune diseases, or a lot of us have health challenges. A lot of us, I recently realized how much work I put into reclaiming my body, like in terms of allowing myself to fall asleep, in terms of eating, in terms of exercising. I literally have to put a tremendous amount of work into my health. I developed, I'll tell you something that happened to me in grad school. One of my professors was the late, great Dr. Esther Buchholz, who was just a brilliant child psychologist. And at one point, I said, I forgot what I was telling her about a health condition I had. And she's like, Robin, at that point, I was in my late 20s. She's like, you're in your 20s. You have asthma, you have arthritis. At that point, I was morbidly obese. So she said, like, your body is really trying to kill you. When are you going to listen to it? It's true. Clearly, it's trying to tell you something. Do you ever want to find out what it's trying to say? And I was like, oh, yeah.
Okay.
So I'd love to hear more about that.
When I saw, I say 100 kids. It was more than that, but a fair number of kids, and I'm looking at them and what's going on with them. And one of the things I felt that I was seeing was an accelerated puberty in these kids. And then I was also seeing evidence of dysregulation of stress response systems in particular. And just everything also seemed awry. And plus, you mentioned the obesity, and that's something that we found also, which is, and that's actually was the genesis of the ACEs study. I'm sure you know those studies. Yeah, it was Vince Felitti was running this weight loss clinic, and he found, like you did, that there's a high percentage of sexual abuse victims. You find that if you go into a migraine clinic, you find that if you go into a lupus clinic, you really find that. So we started with Penny Trickett, who was a developmental psychologist, and I started this study we sort of dated, the first subject was in 1987, and we've been following them. They were 6 to 15 when they came in, and we were, in addition to a fair amount of psychological testing that was going on, we were also studying stress responses in them, including a mild stressor, and then looking at cortisol levels. We were looking at sex hormones, like FSH and LH and estrogen and progesterone, and we were looking at, we had a nurse who was Tanner staging them, which is measuring the sort of sexual development in them, looking at the secondary sex characteristics. We were looking at immune function in them, looking at sort of autoimmune, and we were seeing all of these things happening faster than in our comparison kids. So everybody gets a certain amount of autoimmune garbage in their immune system, to be blunt about it. You get these autoimmune antibodies, and that's often a function of age. But these kids were ahead of adults. The abused kids were ahead of adults in terms of how much they and they had their basically maturation in terms of puberty was about a year ahead of our comparison kids, and we were controlling for a lot of stuff. And the cognitive development was, we all have this curve where you go up and then you kind of come down. They peaked earlier and went down faster. We saw this in their stress responses and their cortisol. So over and over again, we saw evidence that they were maturing faster, they were aging faster. And then sort of the final nail into that hypothesis was that we were able to measure their what they call epigenetic changes in their DNA. So this is sort of, you've got your primary structure of DNA, and then you've got kind of a secondary structure where the DNA wraps around what they call histone cores. And there are little tags that come out, and those tags can be labeled with either methyl groups or acetyl groups, and that changes how the DNA is expressed. And we can compare that to chronological changes. So you have a certain aging in your DNA that's just due to the passage of time, but it can also be biologically accelerated, and that's what we found. And so across multiple different systems, whether it was the gonadal system for the puberty, or the stress response system for the cortisol, or the immune system, or the DNA system, we were seeing consistent evidence of earlier biological aging. Aging is the biggest risk factor for chronic serious illnesses, heart disease, cancers, dementias. All these things are, we associate these as older age illnesses. And so that what we were seeing was evidence that they were getting these much earlier. And the ACE study basically, as I said, found out that if you have these kinds of earlier aging, basically, the truth is you die sooner, but it's not from some weird condition. It's from all of the things we think of as age-related kinds of illnesses, essentially the leading causes of death: heart disease, stroke, cancer.
Yeah. So what you're really saying is, like, we're in the post-traumatic parenting community, we're not imagining this. That, this idea of biological aging is very real. Doesn't mean it's not irreversible, but like, this is not like, especially I think women, we hear a lot from our doctors, like, you're complaining, and especially women who are overweight. I spent a lot of my life quite overweight, and, in one of my pregnancies, I actually turned out had walking pneumonia the entire pregnancy, but I kept going to the doctor and saying, I'm exhausted, I don't feel well, something's wrong. And the doctor just kept saying, well, you're quite overweight and pregnant, what do you expect? I kept saying, I just can't breathe. And, well, you're overweight and pregnant. Yeah. I think having been both morbidly obese and much, much slimmer, like I've existed in many different bodies, I get more respect from a doctor now. So if I go into the doctor now and I say, it also helps to have doctor before my name, because you get a little bit more, like, she's probably not a complete idiot if she has a PhD from NYU. So if she's telling you that she can't breathe, we should maybe pay attention to her. I once was in a hospital and I was and I really did have something quite wrong with me. And someone said to me, "Oh, that's okay, sweetie." And I said, "That's a doctor, sweetie. And I am telling you right now that this is very dangerous." And then and then I got their attention. So I think there's a sense of that. But when a doctor tells you you're imagining things, then of course you're going to believe you're imagining things, but you're saying like, no, biological aging is real.
Yes,
trauma
yes, that's
does
exactly
this.
what I'm saying. I'm saying that you're aging, and you're aging at a pretty fast rate, and that it predicts not good things happening. And there's some data that suggests now if you walk into new trauma with that age already into your system, then you're more likely to have bad outcomes. So there have been studies like where people come into the emergency room, they're adults, they have had a bad trauma, they draw the blood necessary to look at the aging effects, what we call methylation of the DNA. If you've really got methylated DNA, you're much more likely to have a bad outcome as a result of that trauma than if you don't. So it sets you up for more of that. That's one of the things, is trauma is cumulative. And when you walk in with a trauma load, you get more trauma, unfortunately. But no, it's not imagined. It's very real, and it's very widespread biologically. That's in some sense the message of the epigenetic studies, is that we can use different clocks, which are very sort of broad biomarkers, and they say that this is very deeply embedded into your body, into your DNA. Now, just one last point, which is that potentially it's potentially reversible. This is, new, but some of these things, like the methylation, are potentially reversible. So it's possible that someday we might actually have biological markers of therapy.
Yeah. So, and that was the question I was coming to, which is, so how do we reverse it? Like, what trauma treatments work? Like, because your work is profoundly hopeful, but we've been kind of like on a downer. Like, this aged you, this damaged you in some way.
Well, first of all, I think one of the early points we made in this conversation, which is that if you acknowledge your trauma, you're much, 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 much less likely to pass it on, and in terms of your parenting. And so one of the important things is actually to deal with your own trauma, and that really helps. Now, in terms of managing, if you've got a really problematic attachment with a child, then I basically recommend parent-child interaction therapy. You know about PCIT?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
Okay,
I was trained
good.
in PCIT.
I think it's very powerful, and for in terms of making fairly rapid changes in parent-child interactions, that's that kind of intervention, which ends up being generally gratifying in terms of the improved relationships between the parent and the child, are a very good way to sort of intervene into these disturbed attachments.
And then in terms of ourselves and our own trauma treatment,
I recommend
recommend?
basically a CBT approach. I don't think... I think medication takes the edge off of some of the symptoms of depression, the anxiety, but I don't think it's curative. I think the CBT models really help. Now, I don't think you can ever undo it. I think it persists, but you manage it better, it's less disturbing. You have a set of options that allow you, and when you start to fall back into a trauma hole or something, if you've really done your CBT, you know what you can do to intervene. And that's another good thing that's better than medication, because medication, typically, you stop taking it, the effect goes away. If you're getting an effect, you might even have withdrawal kinds of symptoms. It takes a while to build up a therapeutic level, whereas the CBT things, you can haul out your arsenal of CBT for whatever works for you and use it, whether it's 2 years later or whatever. That's where I really try to go, as with these kind of CBT interventions.
Yeah. Because, pills don't teach skills, but sometimes pills get us to the state where we can learn skills so that maybe we need less pills, right? Like there's that interplay. It sounds like, you have specific models you recommend? Like how do you feel about TF-CBT, like trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy? Or are you just saying that the basic CBT approach of really understanding the connection between emotions and body states and thoughts and how to sort of work between them?
Certainly endorse TF-CBT. Okay, that was one of the models that we trained in our trauma treatment center, where we trained therapists in trauma treatment, was TF-CBT. I think that's a pretty well-established model.
Yeah. And how do you feel about the newer wave trauma treatments like IFS or EMDR?
I have not stayed current in a lot of those things. I see them popping up everywhere. And I don't know what the evidence is behind them. It's all I can do to kind of keep up with what I'm doing. And I see all these treatments. I don't see a lot of, studies done that show the efficacy of them. Typically the course is somebody does one, they do a small study, 25 or something like that, and then they go out and start teaching it and training it, and it becomes that kind of model, and then you get into what I call the model wars, where developers are fighting with other developers about whose treatment is best, and I don't think that's very helpful, but I understand how the dynamics work.
Yeah, we go a little backwards. We should develop a model, test it, and then teach it. And what ends up happening is a model is developed. We then create an evidence base for it, which is just the economics, I think, of how the psychology, at least the field that I know best, like the psychology research money is allocated. It is a little backwards to the way a true scientist thinks, right? We have the model, now IFS is building its empirical base, right? EMDR existed way before it was evidence-based, and then the evidence base started building. Not that that's bad, and not that that disproves anything. It's just backwards to how we're trained to think as scientists. In terms of cross generations, how do the effects of child abuse cross generations? That is, I think, a
really important question. And if you go into the literature, there's about 20 different factors that are associated with the sort of intergenerational transmission of what I would call risk for maltreatment across generations. Now, some of those are clearly probably primary, and some of them are probably secondary. So you can look are the parents substance abusing, for example? But you have higher rates of substance abuse in people who have histories of trauma. So it's really more likely that the trauma is their own personal trauma. Probably the biggest risk factors are having had histories of maltreatment. And again, there are other traumas. I speak from maltreatment because that's what I've worked with, and primarily sexual abuse. Right. But there are losing my train of thought. But basically, there are ways in which sort of I think the primary traumas cross generations, and then you get secondary things that add on, like that you're more likely to hook up with somebody who has got similar kinds of trauma histories, or maybe also has substance abuse problems, those sorts of things. But yeah, there's a fair number of factors that have been identified statistically as being significantly related to the transmission. The question is really which are the critical ones and which are kind of secondary effects of those critical ones. And I think that's what I'm quite interested in teasing out at this point in time, and how that's transmitted.
Yeah.
I mean, Parents who have been traumatized have they have the dissociative states, they have the depressive states, they have the anxiety states, so they aren't always as available, for example, and so is it the depression, or is it sort of the lack of availability, those kinds of things. Vigilance is another really important. I mean, I think this is what dissociation really impairs, is the vigilance, and this is when you get back to that issue of the women aren't the abusers, but they are related or associated with partners who are the abusers, and they're not vigilant about that. They don't see it. They don't, doesn't register. And you think, how could you not see that? But they don't, because of the...
Yeah. I feel like a lot of people nowadays are getting their information about like psychology, parenting, everything from social media and the media, and from pop culture. What do you feel like pop culture and the media get wrong about child maltreatment?
A lot. I think the part of the issue is, as we spoke earlier, is that this is a very broad experience. There are a lot of different variants of it, and there are different things that make that kind of maltreatment more or less damaging. Some age at which it happens to you, how long it lasts, what's done to you, very importantly, who does it to you. That's that relationship. And so you get kind of stereotypes in the media, and to some extent I think this is a function of not necessarily the survivors talking about their experiences, but it's the translation into media by the people who sort of manage media, the editors, the writers, the reporters, those sorts of things. They want to make it fit so it's like what people think they know, and so you get this reinforced stereotype over and over again. And really, the range of experiences is huge, and you need to be careful about trying to all shoehorn them into a simple stereotype. So I think much of what the media gets wrong is this attempt to move it into these single stereotypes that have become very common in the media.
Like which stereotypes do you think are the most
I think, for example, that, excuse my voice, excuse me, one is this idea that trauma explodes personality. That, you get this idea that boom, and the person's blown to pieces. Well, that's not what really happens. It doesn't, and it also flies in the face of the fact that most children who are maltreated scores to hundreds or maybe even thousands of times. It's over and over and over and over and over. Just, in our longitudinal study, the average girl was sexually abused once or twice a week for 2 years. But the range, there were some that were sexually abused for 10 years. And then you're starting to talk about hundreds and hundreds of molestations. So the media doesn't, for example, take into that kind of account, that sort of thing. Or the fact that using coercion and violence is also very impactful sorts of things. But the biology, who does it to you, is very critical. Biological fathers, in our data, biological fathers are much more impactful than, say, stepfathers. It's that if the people you trust the most or you expect to trust the most harm you, that's more damaging than people who are, not particularly related to you or you don't see as sort of primary family members.
Yeah. Not that it's great, but what you're saying is when it's the biological father who your body is primed to trust on a very deep level is the source of is the perpetrator, is the source of extreme threat, the level of psychological dysfunction that can create and biological dysfunction that can create is very different. Not that being abused by stepdad is okay. Like, let's just, for the, child abuse deniers out there who, will look at these kinds of things and try to I think there are human brains that just cannot comprehend the enormity of child sexual abuse or child abuse in general, and they just can't wrap their brains around it. And it's not great for those of us who are recovering, whether we're, like for someone like me who was not sexually abused but is recovering from other forms of childhood trauma. The people who just don't want to see it can be very harmful.
I certainly agree. There are some people who they just cannot conceive of it, and so when I would present to, say, general public, there would be people come up and go, I just can't understand how anybody could do that to a child. And I think they're quite genuine. It's just sort of out of their comprehension. And there are other people who don't want to hear it because it's too close to home.
Yeah. Yeah, I once had a mom say to me, and she really said this from a place of ignorance and desire to understand. I'm going to make her sound worse than she is, but she said, I don't understand why there was incest in the family. We were putting a lot of measures in place for how her now adult daughter could come home, feeling that the entire home is unsafe and feeling very let down by her parents because they refused to see the incest for many years. And she was like, I was molested and I'm totally fine. Like, she really couldn't, so why, she can't come home to visit for a weekend, and if her brother drops in, that would be so terrible. I'm fine. And it's like, and it just slipped out, the I was molested and I'm fine, and it was like, but you're not, right? Clearly you failed to see something that had, like you said before about the vigilance, been there, you would have seen, particularly when your daughter all but told you straight out, you're not fine, right? Not that that's a judgmental statement. That's you need to find your own healing statement. But it is very hard for people who don't want to see it, and it's very hard for people who have adapted to it for so many years to say, oh, this is profoundly traumatic, because wait, does that mean that I'm traumatized? That's a very scary thought.
Very true. And people who come to this realization that they were abused, often that's fairly late. I mean, when I was really working more with adults, I would notice these would be 27, 32-year-old women who would have now come to the realization that they had been sexually abused, but they had achieved enough distance and sense of safety that they could look back at it and realize it for what it was. But they couldn't early on. They just shut it out, or they didn't think about it as abuse or whatnot. And it's that, I think, realization that's a very important step in terms of beginning to look for treatment and how has it affected you. I mean, I've always, in my treatment, been like, how is this affecting you now? We're not going to go dig up all the past. I want to know how you think this affects you right now, and we work with that part of it.
Yeah, I because in post-traumatic parenting, I have so many people who have been through very different forms of psychotherapy or who can't access psychotherapy now. I always talk about how every form of psychotherapy that seems to work for trauma has a component of acceptance. This is indeed what happened to me. I can't have counterfactual thinking. I have to, this happened. Integration, what we were talking about integration among states, integrating this trauma into my larger sense of self and meaning. Some sort of a mission or some sort of a sense of meaning for my life's purpose, what we sort of in TFCBT when we do it with kids. I was at Trinitas when Esther Deblinger came down and trained us, and we were one of the child maltreatment sites that used TFCBT in our child maltreatment clinics. So that sort of end chapter where it's here's what I've learned and here's who I am and here's what my future is going to be. To me, every good clinician who works with trauma gives you those three components of AIM in various methodologies and ways. Like you said, we can always get into the models war, but the AIM is what you're going to need in order to successfully become a healthy post-traumatic parent. Is there any final thoughts that you want to leave with the post-traumatic parenting community? Anything we didn't get to that you want to share?
Well, I think we've had a pretty good, wide-ranging. I would just go back to that. If you recognize that these things happen to you, that they affect you, that they affect how you relate to others, that you're dealing with your own trauma, that's probably one of the most important things you can do in terms of helping with post-traumatic stress parenting.
Yeah, meaning like looking inward and processing your trauma is profoundly not selfish, but profoundly for others. I have this line, self-care is childcare, and I'm just hearing that resonance with you of like healing your trauma, working with your trauma, understanding it, integrating it is the best thing you can do for your kids. You're not just doing it for yourself. It's lovely to do it for yourself. We're worth it. But if you're doing it for your kids, it's the opposite of selfish, right? It's the opposite of
I think
that's
well
very
said.
Important.
And this is one of the things particularly that we try to tap into in places like our Every Child Succeeds, was that, by doing these things for yourself, you're doing this for your child. And that we find over and over again, I think I say this in the book, that women will do more things for their children than they'll ever do for themselves. And if they understand that part of it, then it's really to the best.
I love that. Like, by doing this for yourself, you're doing it for your child. I think that's so important for every post-traumatic parent to hear. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I think the entire post-traumatic parenting community is going to really love this conversation. So Old Before Their Time, where can they get it? How can they find out about it? When will it be around in audio?
I think it's in audio not until April, is my guess. But it is out now. Amazon has it. I think some of the other booksellers have it. So you can get it that way. But it will be out in audio, but I don't think, I saw a date of April something or other for audio, so, well, who knows?
Terrific. So you can get
now.
It right now. Right, and the way we are also, you can get, and like I said, eventually one day I'll email you and ask about it again. But I really honestly think it needs to be out in audio form so that parents, like especially moms, can access it. But all of your work is so brilliant and so like sort of trans-theoretical and foundational for anybody who's working with formerly maltreated children who are now adults, whether you're working with actually maltreated children now, because I know we have a lot of therapists who listen to the Post-Traumatic Parenting podcast, but I'm just really so honored and appreciative that we were able to have this conversation.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm here on social media to be descriptive, not prescriptive. I'm here to educate, inform, and hopefully entertain, but never to treat. If listening to this podcast helps you realize that you need therapy, I am all for that. But podcasts aren't therapy. Please reach out to a mental health professional licensed in your jurisdiction. You'll be glad you did. Wish Post-Traumatic Parenting was a talk show, not a podcast? You have a question for me or for my guests? Great news. You can ask those questions by following me on Instagram. My handle is @DrKoslowitz It's also in the show notes. I love it when people reach out, DM, or post a question. Who knows, your question might spark an entire episode. Come join our community. We get it. We're post-traumatic parents too. Can't wait to hear from you.